Open up your Bibles, if you would, to Luke chapter 2. Luke chapter 2, if you're still learning your way around the Bible, notice that the Bible is divided into two categories, the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament starts with Genesis, and the New Testament starts with Matthew, and Luke is in the New Testament. You say, what's the difference? Well, in its simplest form, the Old Testament is before the birth of Jesus, and the New Testament is from the birth of Jesus on. In a more theological term, we're talking about an Old Covenant and a New Covenant. But just if you're beginning, just to keep that in mind. So Luke chapter 2, it's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Here's something interesting about Luke. Luke was a physician, but also he was a Gentile. It's the only gospel, the gospels are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the only gospel that was written by a non-Jew. Matthew and Mark and John were all Jewish. Luke was Gentile, and so he wrote this after much research. And so we're talking about 'tis the season too. When we think about Christmas, as I've said before, that one of the things that can take place in Christmas is that it can amplify whatever's going on in our life. And so if things are good, then that gets amplified. If we're facing challenges or pressure or loss, then that's amplified in our world too. And as we look at what took place around the birth of Jesus, that it's so easy sometimes to just kind of view that as a story, which it's not. It's a historical event that literally took place, that we lose sight of the fact that these are real human beings, that they're people that God used, or God wanted to give an opportunity for them to be used, and the way they would respond to certain things would affect, their role in it, what would be said about them later, much like you and I. And so we're going to look at this in Luke chapter 2, verse 1. It says this: at that time, the Roman Emperor Augustus decreed that a census should be taken throughout the Roman Empire. This was the first census taken when Quirinius was governor of Syria. All returned to their own ancestral towns to register for this census, and because Joseph was a descendant of King David, he had to go to Bethlehem in Judea, David's ancient home. So sometimes people may wonder, why were Joseph and Mary on their way to Bethlehem? Why did they have to go there? Well, this is why: because of the tax that was decreed, he had to go back to his place of ancestry, which was Bethlehem. And isn't it interesting that prophets knew hundreds of years before that the Messiah, Jesus, would be born in Bethlehem? Well, this is why he was there. This is why Joseph and Mary were on their way there. So it says, he traveled there from the village of Nazareth in Galilee. He took with him Mary, to whom he was engaged, who was now expecting a child. And while they were there, the time came for her baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no lodging available for them. Now, let me just say this. I know that we all have different stories in how we grew up. My story is that in our home, I was raised home when we went to church every Sunday. Now, that may not be your story, and that's okay. But we did. It was just like we went to Sunday school like you go to Monday school. And so it was just one of those things that we went, and even if we were out of town, we would go to church, and we called them bulletins. We'd have the pastor sign our bulletin, so we'd get credit for attendance at church. That's just how serious we were about church attendance. And so because of that, I was involved in every Christmas play that ever came along from the time I was 1 year old until probably 13 or something like that. And so at one time, I probably played every person in the nativity. At times my mom would get me a bathrobe and a towel, and we would you have to put a rubber band around it so that you could look like a shepherd or a wise man. And if it was a wise man, I'd have to borrow a nicer bathrobe or something. But anyway, so we'd do that. So I might play the shepherd, I might play the wise man. I probably played Joseph a time or two. I may have played a donkey for all I know. So, but here's the thing: is that we would just do this regularly, and so we kind of knew what had taken place. And the one person that we would talk about was the innkeeper. Now, we're not really quite sure on how this worked out. We just know that there was no place for Joseph and Mary to stay. And so, whether this was an individual that looked at them and said, there's no room in the inn, or just how that worked out, we don't know. But what we do know, what I think we can safely say, is that whoever they approached had no awareness of what it was that God was trying to do on the earth at that time. That God wanted to use them to be a part of his story, part of a significant thing that he was doing in humanity as he makes his appearance to the earth. And that this person, in their busyness, they may not have been hardened. They may not have been, mean or anything. They could have just been totally unaware because they weren't engaged in what God wanted to do in that moment. And so I think about this, that with everything going on and with Christmas, one of the things about it is it's such a busy time. There's so much stuff going on. Matter of fact, our culture is busy. People a lot of times are so gracious to me. They're like, well, I wanted to call you, but I know that you're really busy and that type of thing. And I appreciate that. But we're all busy, right? I mean, you're busy, I'm busy. And I think sometimes that one of the things that we sacrifice that being used in God's plan, we sacrifice the opportunity to be used by Him on the altar of busyness. And one of the reasons why we're able to do that is because being busy is kind of noble in our culture. It's like, well, hey, they're really busy. And we almost say that like it's a medal to be, attained or recognition to be attained. And yet on the other side of that is that if we're not careful, if I'm not careful, I can have moments just like this person that turned them away. And look, what looks like a common moment, because I'm so unaware of what God wants to do, that God really did not intend for it to be a common moment, but my reaction to it would create an uncommon opportunity. I wonder if that person, if they would have known at this moment that God was like, this is the time that the prophets have foretold. He's visiting humanity. This is His answer to our brokenness. Is getting ready to show up, and I want you to be a part of it. I wonder if his response would have been different. I wonder if it would have been more like, you know what, we don't have any rooms, but you can have mine. And before I throw any rocks at this individual, I have to realize that I'm almost sure there have been moments in my own life like that I've gotten so distracted, so disconnected from what God wants to do that I was just unaware that this moment that seemed common to me, because I wasn't connected with His presence or His purpose, that I treated like a common moment where if I had just listened to His voice, He had uncommon intentions that He was going to do. Number one is this: it's the season to make room for Jesus in our life. That in every crowded season, to make sure that it's not so crowded, not so busy, that we crowd Him out. That we schedule Him out. It's not intentionally or on purpose, but we haven't purposely scheduled Him in. So that we miss those moments where God wants to use us for uncommon things, but because we're so busy and so distracted that we're not even aware of what He wants to do in this moment. At some point you wonder if the individual that was connected to this that says we don't have any room, if there was ever an awareness of the opportunity they missed. My hope is that in the busyness of everything that takes place, that in this season that we're reminded of that. I love Christmas. I mean, I like the music. I like all the stuff. I like the interaction with family and my son Daniel. He's our middle child. He's here today. He's here from Amarillo. One of the reasons he's here is because around the Christmas holidays he comes visits us. I love that part of it. But I know that for any of us, that we can get so connected with everything that's going around that if we're not careful, that whisper of God's voice can be drowned out with just the busyness of our world. So of all the things that it's the season to, one of the things that we have to make sure that it doesn't become so crowded that Jesus has no place, not in our culture, but in our life. You know how He becomes a part of our culture? If He's a part of my world, part of my life. So number one is this, is we have to make room for Jesus in your life. Look at number two. Go with me, if you would, to Matthew chapter 2. You're in Luke. Matthew is 2 books before Luke. So before Luke is Mark, before Mark is Matthew. Matthew chapter 2, verse 7. Matthew chapter 2, verse 7. And it says this, then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Then he told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. After this interview, the wise men went their way. Everybody say their way. And the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasure chests and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route. Everybody say another route. For God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. And so right here we have this situation where these men, that they were called wise men, they were rulers from a different part of the world, that they had been pursuing what God was doing in the earth. They'd noticed this star and it caught their attention. So they set aside their world, they set aside the things that were going on, and they began to find out, God, what is it you're doing in the world right now? Now I think it's interesting that the other people saw this, but it didn't grab their attention in the busyness of their life, but it grabbed these guys' attention. Now, a lot of times when we do the picture of the nativity and stuff like that, we show this picture of these wise men and the shepherds being there. But the truth of the matter is that those events didn't take place at the same time. The shepherds were there around the birth of Jesus. The wise men showed up, we think probably when Jesus was about 2 years old, somewhere in there, between 1 and 2 years old. And so they appeared to Herod. They came and talked to Herod because they said, hey, look, we're here to find out where the king of the Jews is. And I'm sure Herod was like, because he was the ruler over Judea. And so probably on the inside, he's like, what do you mean you're here to find the king of the Jews? That's me. And so they said, but that his birth has been foretold about and we're here to discover it. And so they didn't realize that Herod was a narcissistic, self-promoter kind of guy. And so this was a threat to him. But he said to them in his deception, he goes, go find out where he is and then come back and tell me because I want to worship him too. Well, that wasn't true. Herod's intent was to kill the baby that they came to worship. And later on, in his attempt to destroy that baby, then he killed all the male children that were 2 years old and under. And so these guys, they came this certain route that as they were on their way to find what God was doing here, that God began to lead them in a unique way. They saw this star. The star appeared to them. And so it was a way that he had never led them before. So they began to follow that direction. And as they go, what was unfamiliar at one time, over time became familiar and then began to be comfortable. And so it continued to lead them. They finally got to where God had led them to be. We don't know how many of them there were. Yes, I know we sing a hymn that says, we three kings and all that kind of stuff. But we really don't know. We know they brought 3 gifts. And I would imagine those gifts were given so it would sustain Mary and Joseph and Jesus whenever they had to go to Egypt because God had directed them away from what Herod was doing. So they needed some way to sustain themselves while they were away from home. And so that's probably what that had done. But we know that they were led that way. Then when they got there and they did what they'd set aside so much of their life. They'd set aside so much of their responsibility in pursuit of what God was doing in this moment, in pursuit to be in his presence simply. And then when they get there, God deals with them and he's like, I'm going to lead you a different way. And I think we have to understand this, that in this moment, that as we make room for Jesus in our world, that we have to be ready for him to give us direction and leadership and take us different places, different ways, different things he's called to. Maybe you're praying for your marriage right now. And as you make room for him in your life, that he'll give you direction, a different way to love your spouse, a different way to serve them. As parents, sometimes it can be really challenging in parenting. We want to make sure that we're doing the right thing. We want to make sure that in our own brokenness, in our own immaturity, that we don't mess them up too bad. Yeah, thank you. And so we know what I'm talking about, right? So, and just make sure that we don't do that. But as we seek God, that he gives us direction on how to parent our kids. And he speaks to us about the things that he has for us. And he deals with us about the stuff in our life and gives us direction. That he'll deal with me about things in my public life. In other words, that's the world that everybody sees me in. That he'll show me a different way to conduct my affairs, a different way to behave than what I have been. One of the things he deals with me is that whenever I'm around people I know in an area I know, that it's just easier for me to be kind. If I'm in a place where nobody knows me and like service doesn't live up to my expectation, sometimes I can find myself not being kind, man, and God deals with me about that. Like, why does that change? So he deals with this in our public setting. And then he deals with this in our private area. The private part of our life that only a few people get to see us in this moment, where some of the walls come down. The people that see how we respond when we're disappointed. The people like if you're an OU fan, they get to see how you respond when the pressure's on. They get to see how I respond when the pressure's on. And sometimes it's not pretty. I'm talking about them and me. And so here's the thing is that that all of those things, that people that are around us, but he deals with me. and how to deal with people that are in that private circle. And then in that area of my life that's the secret part of my life, that only me and God know what's taking place. And so many times that deals with motives. Like not just what you're doing, but why are you doing this? Attitudes. Sometimes even behavior that we keep hidden from the rest of the world. But he deals with us in the direction that we go as we spend time. He wants to change the direction we're headed. He wants to show us another way to do things, another way to go. But we don't get that by being indifferent to his voice. We don't get that by just kind of letting the world go on. These guys got that because they were pursuing what it was he wanted to do in that moment. There were some things they had to say no to in order to say yes to this. And that's intentional, isn't it? And the challenge for most of us, I don't think, is the fact that we're wrapped up in doing all these bad things. I think the challenge is, again, for most of us, is that we're so wrapped up in being busy. That we're pursuing all these noble things, all these worthwhile things to miss out on the thing. And that's the presence of God. So if Christmas should be anything in the middle of this busiest time of the year, where we're going from one program to the other, we're going from one thing to the other. I love every season, but can I say this, that with my kids, is this going to make me a bad father if I say this, that one of the things as they got older that I was really kind of glad of is that I didn't have to go see any more of their Christmas programs. Is that okay if I say that? They didn't want to be there. You say, why were they there? Because their mom made them go. Same reason I was there. And so does that make me a bad dad? But in those times, it was just such a busy season. You guys didn't want to be there, did you? You didn't want to. You're probably wondering why I subjected you to it, because I had to be there too. So anyway, but that's so much, we can just get so caught up in so many things that just seem good that somewhere along the line that we haven't made room for Jesus. And then even that once we start doing that, we begin to pursue him, that he begins to deal with us and speak to us about our world and about the direction he wants us to go. These guys had set aside some things in order to pursue what God was doing in this moment. And he took the unfamiliar and it became familiar and it became the comfortable. And then instead of saying, I'm going to lead you another way, just continue to follow the star, he said, I'm going to lead you a different way. And he spoke to him. How did they find that? By being in his presence. God's a good God. He's living and he wants to speak to us. And you know what I found out he'll talk to you about? Whatever you talk to him about. If we want him to speak to us about our marriage, you know what we need to do? Talk to him about our marriage. If we want him to speak to us about our future, you know what we do? Talk to him about our future. If we want him to speak to us about our parenting, about our children, or about our relationships, what do? We talk to him about those things. And so as we speak to him, then he begins to give us God thoughts. He begins to reveal things to us. He begins to show us things. And sometimes it's different than what we've been used to. But he leads us. Number 2 is this. So it's the season, let his presence change direction in our life. Let's look at number 3 and we'll close with this. Go with me, if you would, to Luke chapter 1, verse 11. Luke chapter 1, verse 11. It says, while Zechariah was in the sanctuary, an angel of the Lord appeared to him standing to the right of the incense altar. Zechariah was shaken and overwhelmed with fear when he saw him, but the angel said, don't be afraid, Zechariah. God has heard your prayer. Everybody say, God has heard your prayer. Now make it personal. Say, God has heard my prayer. Say it again. God has heard my prayer. I think about this, that first of all, I understand Zechariah kind of being wigged out whenever he saw Gabriel, because it was an angel, and I'm sure that there was this impressive presence where it's like, oh my goodness, and Gabriel's like, hey dude, chill. I'm here because God's heard your prayer. And I do wonder, especially when we look at his response in just a minute, was it because that prayer had been prayed such a long time ago that as far as Zechariah was concerned, that it wasn't going to come to pass? Well, let's look and see what the rest of his reaction is here. And he said, God has heard your prayer. And he said, your wife Elizabeth will give you a son, and you are to name him John. You will have great joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth. For he will be great in the eyes of the Lord. He must never touch wine or other alcoholic drinks. He will be filled with the Holy Spirit even before his birth. And he will turn many Israelites to the Lord their God. He will be a man with the spirit and power of Elijah. He will prepare the people for the coming of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and he will cause those who are rebellious to accept the wisdom of the godly. Zechariah said to the angel, that is so exciting. I knew this day was coming. The 5 of you that are following along with me know that that's not true. This is what he said. Zechariah said to the angel, how can I be sure this will happen? I'm an old man now. And fellas, watch what he did. He didn't say, and my wife is an old woman. This is how he addressed it. He goes, I'm an old man now, and my wife is also well along in years. He was much kinder. We can all learn something by watching this guy and his approach to his wife. But then he said this. Then the angel said, I am Gabriel. I stand in the very presence of God. It was he who sent me to bring you this good news. But now, since you don't believe what I said, you will be silent and unable to speak until the child is born. For my words will certainly be fulfilled at the proper time. So Zechariah said, dude, I'm old. And my wife, she's advanced in years. How can this be? And I don't know about you, but sometimes, man, one of the challenges in my prayers is the fact that when it doesn't happen immediately, then all of a sudden this discouragement begins to set in, and then disappointment, and then disillusionment, and then after disillusionment, disconnection. Because it doesn't happen as quickly. And then I begin to look at my resources, and I begin to say, there's no way this can happen. That's where Zechariah was. He's like, I'm too old. I'm too old, and she's almost too old. And so he saw this, and I wonder if it had been years since he'd prayed that prayer, that he'd given up on it and walked away from it. He's just like me sometimes, man. It's hard for me to trust the timing of God. Isn't it you that it's like, why hasn't it happened yet? I guess it's not going to happen. If it was going to happen, it would have already happened. And I miss the timing of God just because in my discouragement, in my disappointment, in my disillusionment, in my disconnection, I walk away from that prayer. But to know that God has stored it in his heart to later on be manifested where it's like, God's heard your prayers. He's heard your prayers. I'm here because the Lord has heard your prayers. And we have to be reminded to trust the timing of God. It's one of the great struggles for me. Because sometimes when it's not happening quick enough, I get frustrated. And I want to know, why hasn't this taken place? Why isn't this going on? And you begin to just have this disillusionment, disconnection from God. And it's like, I guess it's not going to happen. Well, who said? The calendar? The clock? My own personal resources? Well, my prayers indicated that I couldn't bring it to pass on my own. When did that change? When did it become something that I can make happen anyway? But as time goes on, then we begin to feel like that if it was going to happen, it never would have. And we lose sight of having confidence in the timing of God. I've said this before, that Galatians says that in due season we'll reap if we faint not. I don't know when due season is for you, but I know when it is for me. You know when it is for me? Longer than I want it to be. And so many times, man, due season, it's like, man, I feel like I'm about to burst. Like, come on, God, surely it's going to take place now. Surely it's going to happen now. And again, Zechariah was a guy just serving God, praying for his wife, trying to be a good husband, spending time in the presence of God, taking care of the temple. And one day in his prayers, he says, God, we just want to have a kid. Give us a child. And after years goes on and it doesn't happen, that he assumes that because it didn't take place in his timing, that it's not going to happen at all. Not aware that his prayer, as great as it was, didn't recognize how great the plan of God was for this son that God had ordained for them to give birth to. That their child was going to be the child that God would use to prepare the way for Jesus, to preach the kingdom and repentance to humanity. So the people's hearts would be open and ready to recognize that the Messiah has been sent to the earth. That he couldn't just be born at any time because he was so connected to this part of God's plan for humanity that the timing had to be perfect. And so what Zechariah viewed as indifference, or what he viewed as an unwillingness to answer his prayer, was simply God knowing the greatness of what he was asking and the role that it would play in his plan, knowing that it had to take place at the right time. I want to speak to any of you right now that are in a place that you feel like that your world is being controlled by somebody else. That you're in a place where you feel like you have no say in what's taking place at your job, in things that are going on, or those things that you've dreamed about. There's this real frustration, discouragement. That if you'll continue to hold fast to God's purpose and his presence for your life, that his timing will be just right, and that the things that ultimately happen in your life, that as he reveals those things, that you can trust him to position you and to prepare you and to move you to the place that he has for you. I know what it's like, man. I mean, I feel like so much of my life, the things that I've wanted always happen later than everybody else's. God, I'd like for this to have happened 10 years ago. I think about this, that where we're at now, as I've shared with you before, that part of my prayer was, Lord, I just want to go back home. I want to go back home and start a church there. I want to get my life there. And I think about, man, there are times I'm like, I wish I could have done this 10 years earlier. Say, why didn't it happen 10 years earlier? Because the time wasn't right. You know what happened here? Because it was just the right time. It was when things were ready. Jesus even said that he's going to go away and prepare a place, and when things are ready, he'll return. And so we have to trust the timing of God. I hope in saying this that some of you are encouraged that just because you're in a hard season right now doesn't mean that God's given up on you, doesn't mean that he's forgotten about you or walked away. And also to kind of rekindle and re-stir up some of those things that you've prayed about, that now because so much time has passed that you've just kind of come to the conclusion that I guess he didn't hear me. And yet if an angel was to appear before your presence, he would say, God's heard your prayers. He's heard your prayers. And that this is a moment to trust his timing. Number 3 is this, is it's a season to remember to trust God's timing for our world, for the things that he's called us to do, for the things we prayed for. When's it going to happen? In due season. At just the right time. If you faint not. Hold on to the promise of God and trust his timing for your world. And let this, as you look at Zechariah, who lost hope because he quit trusting the timing of God. And yet God in his goodness and faithfulness brought it to pass. Continue to trust the timing of God. I want us to do something. Christmas is such a time to, if we use it right, to consecrate, to set aside the things that God has for us. We had the Advent service last Sunday evening. Many of you came. Thank you for coming to that. But I wanted, in this Christmas season, as we're reminded of these things, to serve. I want us to have communion together. And I'm going to ask the ushers to begin to serve communion. And as they do, we're going to hand out the elements. There'll be 2 cups stacked on top of each other. And so you'll hang on to both of those, and then don't take communion yet. We'll take that together. But I want it to be a time of consecration, a time of us committing our lives to God, committing the things that he has for us, trusting his timing, making room for Jesus in our world in the season and all the things that he wants to do for us, to do that. And so let's take this together. You say, well, Rick, I don't go to this church. I'm like, man, if you're a Christ follower, if Jesus is Lord of your life, you're part of the family, then you're welcome to take communion with us. For those of you that church is a new thing, you're like, what is this? I don't know what's going on here. Jesus gave us something. It's kind of like an object lesson, a reminder of what he's done for us. And so this is that moment. He said, do this to remember him. So we're just following his instruction there. And I'm going to give you more instruction in just a moment. But as the ushers serve you, then let's just take time just to spend a moment with God and just make some decisions to give him a chance to speak into our life, to intently pursue him. And so let's just take a moment right now to spend time with God.